It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us, Vivian Walt, Paris correspondent for Time magazine. How are you?
Great.
Great. Okay. Also with us, Richard Verly, Paris correspondent for Swiss daily newspaper Le Temps. How are things with you?
Perfect. I came back from Geneva this morning and it was snowing.
It's Christmas in Paris. Anyway. Elsa Vidal, news director at sister station Radio France International's Russian language service. Welcome to the show.
Good evening. Thank you.
And we're joined from Jerusalem by correspondent Gwendoline de Bono, just back from Kyiv. Gwendoline de Bono, who will be seeing some clips of what she has been up to over there. You can also, by the way, listen and like The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other fine streaming services. Let's start with the good news. Radiation levels quite normal around Chernobyl, so says the head of the UN's nuclear watchdog. He confirmed, by the way, that Russia has pulled back from the site of Europe's worst ever nuclear disaster. The IAEA working with both sides to avoid Chernobyl becoming a front line again. What with Ukraine's Atomic Energy Agency claiming that Russian soldiers were told to dig trenches nearby, kicking up radioactive dust in the nearby Red Forest, which is a no-go zone ever since 1986. The Red Forest off limits because of that disaster. Here's how Ukrainian authorities reported on it. They said that, quote, not surprisingly, the occupiers received significant doses of radiation and panicked at the first sign of illness, and it showed up very quickly. Vivian Walt, your thoughts on this? I mean, let's think about this for a second. Chernobyl was on the front line back in February and on the front line once again in March.
You know, what's so strange about the story is that, of course, the Russians went into the exclusion zone very quickly, as soon as the invasion began almost, and then effectively held the entire workforce hostage for weeks. The reports were that they were forced to kind of work at gunpoint. And I mean, the whole episode, so much has happened in the last 5 weeks, but one forgets that the whole episode of Chernobyl, which began very early and has really not ceased, has been one of the more strange twists and turns of this war.
Now, once again, this is a claim by the Ukrainians. There's no independent confirmation that those Russian soldiers actually did dig trenches or had to flee because of radiation.
We would assess at this early stage that it's of a piece of this larger effort to refit and resupply, and not necessarily done because of health hazards or some sort of emergency or a crisis at Chernobyl.
Yeah, so a piece of a larger effort to refit and resupply, not necessarily done because of health hazards or some sort of emergency at Chernobyl, there says the Pentagon's spokesperson. And so, yeah, there's a little bit of a fog of war element, if you will, on both sides of this, the ground war and the information war, which, by the way, works on both sides. Here's how the news channel Russia 24 reports on that fire that broke out during the taking, not at Chernobyl, but at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That's in the south of the country.
It was a group of Ukrainian saboteurs who attacked the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It sounds unbelievable, but there are people in the highest levels of the Ukrainian Secret Service and armed forces who are ready to carry out nuclear provocations. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, such attempts could happen again. The aim is clear: to blame it on the Russian Federation. In other words, it's nuclear terrorism.
So, Elsa Vidal, if we understand correctly, Russia had to intervene because Ukraine was on a suicide mission to have a nuclear blow-up of their own country?
Yes, it seems that from the Russian perspective, Ukrainians are not only Nazis, but they are also suicidal, which is highly, as you understand, to be doubted. But that's the kind of fantasy the Russians have been feeding their population and us for quite some weeks already.
And it works? How much does this work?
It depends on the target you are currently discussing. If you speak of Western audiences, it's obvious that it doesn't work that much. But if you speak of people who are sitting in front of their television and have been deprived, especially in the very recent weeks, of independent information, then you can see that in the public poll, there is a support for this operation and for this war. Although you cannot believe exactly the results of those polls, it definitely shows that there is a core in the population who support the policy that has been pursued.
All right, we have the connection now with Jerusalem and correspondent Gwendoline de Bono, who's just back from Ukraine. Gwendoline, were the plants watered? Have you been able to open the mail since you got back?
I'm sorry?
Have you been able to unpack your bags?
I think.
Unpack.
Yes, I did unpack my bag, actually. Yes. Thank you.
We've been talking about, the ground war and the information war. I'll ask you about the latest. Kyiv denying Russian claims that Ukrainian helicopters crossed 40 kilometers into Russian territory and hit a major fuel depot in the city of Belgorod. Again, what can we make when we get reports like this from one side or the other?
Well, it's sure that we have to be very careful, and it's quite difficult sometimes to have confirmation and to have information about what happened. And sometimes as well, the Ukrainian forces does not want to say everything, because it's a big advantage. They fight against Russian army, so they have to be quite discreet on what they are doing. And we saw that as a journalist when we are on the field. They are really disciplined. They're always asking journalists, for example, not to film blog posts, not to film position, and even the people are really disciplined with that. So it's quite difficult for these helicopter attacks. I just know that the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Ukraine say that he's not able to confirm or to deny it. So it's this kind of information, when you are working on the field, really, really difficult to know more about.
The Ukrainian Defense Ministry has since denied it, saying they didn't do it. Does it seem plausible? Could Ukraine really mount a helicopter attack 40 kilometers inside of Russia?
Honestly, I don't know. It could be possible, but it's really difficult to know. And again, I think the two persons who really know about that are the two pilots of the helicopters.
All right. Well, near the capital, Gwendoline, you were able to follow, if it wasn't helicopters, perhaps it was drones, the Aerozovitska drone unit. Let's listen to one of their commanders.
We work night and day. We observe them. We determine their exact location, fly, and then strike. Sometimes they hear us because some drones have a recognizable sound. When they hear that sound, then we can see them running away in a panic, lying down, hiding. But not all of them make it. Our main challenge is the lack of equipment. We have to hand it to our enemy. They work very hard, and they're very good at counter-operations, at electronic warfare. So almost every day we lose equipment. That's why we keep asking for support. We need it, and we see new equipment come from the world over.
So we have Gwendoline de Bono, this asymmetrical war. Would you say the Ukrainians are winning the asymmetrical war?
I don't know if they are winning for now, but it's clearly a major battlefront, the cyber one, and let's say the tech one. several times the Russians tried in the past few weeks to hack telecommunication system, civilian system, military system, and Ukrainians are trying to do the same because there are many IT engineers in Ukraine, and for example, I met some group of people, IT engineer, and they just quit their job and they go into what they call the territorial defense, but as IT engineer. So there is a major battlefront. And to go back to this unit, it's very interesting because in 2014, this unit was just a group of volunteers, quite efficient, and they became so efficient that 1 year later, they finally be part of the Ukrainian army, the official Ukrainian army. And they are always trying to find new solutions. For instance, they are building attack drone completely from scratch in factories. They are always trying to adapt, to take the human abilities, but to put them directly in the battlefield. For instance, I was talking with another young guy, a member of this unit. He was an IT engineer. He left the unit like two years before, and when the war started, he came back to the unit, and he was trying to work on an app, like a mobile application, in order to put in real-time Russian position, so that the Ukrainian soldier can see the position and be more precise when they are launching attack, more precise with the artillery. So they can be more efficient and waste less ammunition. And the commander we just heard, I was asking him, what is one of your major advantage over a Russian army, for example? And he said, we are very creative, that's for sure. And you see that. He told me we are more creative, more open-minded, and sometimes this way of thinking allow them to act, to move on the battlefield in a way that is quite unexpected for the adversary.
Yeah, we heard Richard Verly, though, in that clip, the drone commander paying tribute to the adversary, saying they're good as well. But your thoughts on this sort of asymmetrical war, which from what Gwendoline witnessed,
well, I think you summarized it well when you talked about the fog of war. And the fog of war is itself a weapon. Russia may have some interest to keep this fog of war. It might be interesting and it might be useful for Russian forces to sometime withdraw from certain areas in order to reinforce other units. So we should be careful at not taking any withdrawal from Russian forces as a defeat, as a setback. It may be part of a movement. It may be part of a redesign of their offensive. So let's be careful about that. Now, coming to the Ukrainian, soldiers or territorial defense who talk to journalists, for sure, they have been putting up a very strong fight so far, and it was probably a surprise for the Russian army. But it's also propaganda on the Ukrainian side. Their obvious interest is to say that they are beating up the Russian unit, they are very smart, blah, blah, blah. The reality, I'm not sure we know it exactly. Coming back to Chernobyl, at the beginning it made sense for Russian troops to control Chernobyl because they were probably planning to have an advance up to far in the west of Ukraine. So they needed to secure Chernobyl. Since then, the mobility of their troops has been affected and they have withdrawn to the east. So you see, the landscape of war is changing, so I'm not surprised that the lines are changing and that the fog of war is covering up.
And again, when we talk about tactics, when we talk about the kinds of weapons that are used, including drones, we see, it's on the one hand between Russia and Ukraine, but the information war is global. And when we see things like Elon Musk's Starlink satellite system being enrolled on the side of the Ukrainians, do you think to yourself it's just between Russia and Ukraine, or is it already a world war, Vivian Walt?
Well, I think it's got quite a ways to go until it becomes a world war, which it could become. And I think it's got quite some road to travel before it gets to that point. I think what's interesting, and Gwendoline put it her finger on it a little bit, is this kind of disjuncture between the country which has kind of harnessed its brain power, such as it is, to create tactics for this war, as opposed to Russia, where you've had this most incredible brain drain over the last 6 weeks. You've had, the entire sort of best and the brightest of the young IT generation are leaving or are unable to work. And so in that way, I think that's a good disjuncture. But I do want to say I'm very glad what Richard said, because, all the talk about, the Ukrainians are so brave, and certainly they are. Let's not forget their entire economy is utterly at a standstill. And the forecast now is that there will be at least a 20% contraction in the Ukraine economy. On the other hand, you have giant Russia, much of which its economy is still ticking along, particularly its oil and gas exports, of course. And I think Richard is quite right. This whole specter of the Russians so-called withdrawing is possibly just moving into a much more kind of lethal stage of the war.
Yeah, who's got who over a barrel? Vladimir Putin on Thursday warning, for instance, that as of April 1st, you either pay for natural gas in rubles or we shut the tap. Payments to be made through Gazprom's bank. Germany's chancellor calling the Russian president's bluff, while at the same time making provisions that should the Kremlin indeed cut off Europe. Olaf Scholz, who reacted alongside his visiting Austrian counterpart.
If you ask me, is it a terrible feeling to be dependent on Russian gas at the moment? Yes. Feelings cannot trump, and that goes especially for me as Austrian Chancellor, being responsible for security of energy supplies and the functioning of the economy.
Listening there, Elsa Vidal, to the Austrian Chancellor, it sounds like Russia's got the upper hand almost.
Well, no, it's mainly for Vladimir Putin. It's a question of status. So he has to show that he's not being taken off the grid, but that he is instead the guys who control the tap.
That's a clearly worried Austrian leader there.
Of course, we are not all European countries are not exposed at the same level. For some of us, if there is no solidarity mechanism that is to be created now, then of course some of us will be hit far heavier than others. So there is a first, it's normal because we're going to have maybe protests in Europe when all the prices will hit sailing. So he has to be worried. Nobody wants that, but that's a price where we seem to be ready to pay, first. And secondly, I think it's really important for Vladimir Putin to show that he is in command, but the reality is that gas and oil amounts to 40% of the federal budget.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. If Putin wants to start this gamble, why should not, the European Union go with the gamble?
Absolutely.
Let him stop the flow of gas and stop the flow of oil. I'm not too sure that there will be protests in the streets. When you see the wave of support for Ukraine at the moment, I think Europeans could stand some time with difficulties, energy problems, and so on. The Americans will send more LNG, probably at that time. So let's play this gamble, if that's the gamble he wants. I don't think it's a very good idea to go by what Putin says always.
No, we have to stand. First, we have to stand united. It could be also a try just to see how united we are and how we could be bypassing one of us. And it's likely that his proposal to use Gazprom Bank is clearly to make us pay to support the Russian currency, and it's out of question.
All right, so there are countries that are either for or against Ukraine. There are those that are trying to stay out of it. A good example, the Russian foreign minister right now in India, which is purchasing Russian oil at a 30% discount. And Delhi, which after China welcomed Sergei Lavrov this week. Gwendoline de Bono, you're sitting in one of those countries that's trying to stay out of it, or at least trying to act as a broker as well, Israel. Can you stay out of it, or by staying out of it, are you enabling Moscow?
Well, for Israel, there are many strategic interests, and the first one, I think, for the government is their ability to strike Hezbollah and Iranian position in Syria, and the need, the approval of Moscow to continue to do that. So for the Israeli government, it's really important to find kind of a balance because. Obviously, it's quite complicated position. So, at the time when the war started, for example, they sent in Ukraine ambulances, armored ambulances, humanitarian aid, but they really try, to stay a bit away from all that because they are in a difficult position. Plus, there is many people here who are living in Israel who are from Ukraine and from Russia. For example, I was in a protest before heading Ukraine, and it can be quite tense between the Ukrainian and the Russian who are living in Israel. So yes, for Israel, it's quite hard to find the balance.
Back here in Europe, there's a united front in solidarity with Ukraine, as we were saying. Even in Hungary, where the longtime incumbent Viktor Orban has muted his past admiration for Vladimir Putin, this in the run-up to Sunday's general election. Now, speaking of elections, you could almost forget that come a week from Sunday, here in France, we're picking a president. The war in Ukraine instead grabbing headlines. But after giving Emmanuel Macron a massive boost in the polls, that lead not quite as solid as it once was. Now, Macron is still a shoo-in to make the April 24th runoff. But if, as expected, it's a rematch of the last election in 2017, the incumbent is very far from the 66% of the vote he won in the second round in 2017 against the far right's Marine Le Pen. Macron, well, at the same time trying to stay above the fray, hitting a little bit the campaign trail, and forced to answer questions about that Senate Commission report that's blasted the outsourcing of government policy on his watch, particularly during the COVID pandemic, to private consultants like U.S. firm McKinsey.
Quand on veut accélérer, aller très vite et très fort sur une politique, il faut parfois avoir recours à des prestataires extérieurs à l'État. Et donc, il ne faut pas tout confondre. Donc, je souhaite que ce débat soit un débat éclairé, où chacun justifie de sa dépense. Je ne vais pas, moi, justifier de chaque contrat. Je ne les connais pas, c'est pas moi qui les ai passés.
So here we are, we're like, 8 or 9 days out, and we're talking about McKinsey and talking about private consultants. Why is that, Elsa Vidal?
Why do we do that? But I think it's totally part of any presidential campaign. It's just normal to try to exploit all the weaknesses of your adversaries, I'd say.
All right. It's, by the way, not the first time that the consultants have made headlines for all the wrong reasons. We could show you a Financial Times cartoon from 2017, a reminder that in the end, McKinsey had to pay out more than $100 million in damages as one of the firms involved in South Africa's so-called state capture scandal. Vivian Walt, you remember that well.
Indeed.
This business about consultants, why is it coming to the fore all of a sudden?
I mean, yes. Firstly, there's several things to unpack here. One is McKinsey has a lot of involvement in a lot of different countries which have not gone particularly well. The second thing is this is France. It's a country which prides itself on excellent civil service and, in fact, an enormous public sector, which has been trying to trim a little bit, but nonetheless has, many, many public servants who are supposed to do this very well. If you recall, the rollout of the vaccine campaign was really botched until they did bring McKinsey in.
So an erosion of that civil service is what you're saying?
I think it probably exposed the fact that the government was not doing particularly well. It was clear, I think, to a lot of people that whatever it is that McKinsey actually did work to change the government's strategy on the pandemic. And the pandemic is a very good reason why Macron has been in such a strong position electorally.
All right, and that brings us to what Richard Verly's been doing in his spare time. You have penned a book. You went on the road. You published France Against Itself. The book compares the country's fault lines in this 2022 election and in the wake of the Yellow Vests movement and that anger over the erosion of the state, with 1940, when the Nazi invaders cut the country in two, directly at the time administering the northern part and allowing the collaborator Vichy regime to administer points south of a 1,200-kilometer line of demarcation. And you went all along that line, like, for instance, to Louis Pasteur's home village in the Jura Mountains, near your native Switzerland.
Correct.
And you talk about this feeling that the fault lines, the demarcation line of 2022 is a little bit akin to what Viv is describing.
Yes, indeed. Well, the idea of doing this book and doing this travel along the demarcation line came actually from a conference Eric Zemmour gave in Switzerland in 2018.
This is the far-right candidate.
Yeah, correct. The far-right candidate, one of the far-right candidates. And he was talking at that time, and he's still talking about the disappearance of France. And his main argument is to say that he has to be elected to avoid the fact that France could disappear. So I went to see whether in 1940, which was a moment when France could have disappeared, why France did not disappear. And the reason is that France is strong. It's a strong country, and French people are able to cope with great difficulties. Now, coming to what Viviane said, I see McKinsey as another explanation. It's the lack of confidence, the lack of trust between the government and the administration in France. The administration, in a way, has gone differently, has diverged from the government. And there is a deep mistrust between the so-called government elite in Paris and the administration on the ground. And don't forget,
and you make an exception in your book, which is local mayors.
That's what I say. And when you see, when France is confronted, and that was the case in 1940, with a great explosion, a great trauma, then people care about themselves and find solution. And I think the problem for Macron is he had, and his government had to find quick fix solution in the time of pandemic, also because of the pressure of the media. Let's look at ourselves. We always want the government to come up with statistics, with figures, with results, while the administration is much slower. What McKinsey is doing is coming to the government and say, hey, we can provide you with whatever you want in a very short time. Media will be happy. Just pay. That's what they did, and I don't think it was necessary.
You talk about this colossal defiance, never resolved, never healed, when it comes to the people in those areas where factories have closed, right? There's less public services than before.
True. You know, there is a lot of talk about this peripheric France, the France périphérique, which is, let's say, beyond the main metropolis. But the France I visited, which is the central part of France, is a different part of France. It's very rural, it's agricultural, and it used to be, let's say, the bed of the country. And the Republic was somewhat founded on that center of France. And now people, they are very disillusioned because they don't see a real future. The irony is when I ask survivors of that period or historians what was their main feeling about 1940, what they remember. They remember that at that time it was war, but everything was possible. Now it's peace, but everything is impossible.
Elsa Vidal, your thoughts? What's at stake in this election in 2022 for you?
My take for this election?
Yeah, what's at stake?
Well, for the time, I'd say as a simple voter, for me, it's going to be, I think, the fourth round when I'm more or less obliged to choose between a terrible national threat and not do a political choice. So I think many French are finding themselves in such a position, and trying to avoid the worst fate for your country isn't a match for a political project or a direction. So I think most French are now lacking a sense of history or towards which society we are heading and what is the collective dynamic we are following.
Do you think the war in Ukraine helps concentrate the minds?
Yes, definitely. War is always such a big tool in history. I think it shapes imagination, it mesmerizes our attention. And definitely, if we come back to Ukraine, we can see that this war has definitely been a turning point for the national identity and for the people to come around the President Zelensky that was not enjoying such a big support before this war.
And here in France?
Sorry?
And here in France?
And in France, people are pretty much touched, and I think by supporting the Ukrainian people, they feel they are part of a heroic path and a storytelling that enables them to be active.
What's going to be the issue that determines whether or not Emmanuel Macron gets re-elected, Vivian?
I don't think it's going to be Ukraine, although I'm sure that Emmanuel Macron wishes it was Ukraine. And in some ways, it does play into it. I mean, curiously enough, Zelensky and Macron are pretty much exactly the same age. I think they're a few weeks apart in age. Mm-hmm. And Macron has kind of, in a sense, recently been almost modeling himself after Zelensky, but it doesn't work. They're extremely different personalities and different kinds of leaders. What's going to define this election and Macron's prospects is the economy. And it comes up in every single poll. And what Richard's talking about is the kind of distrust, the alienation is one that's been building for so many years between the elite of Paris, which Macron really embodies, and the rest of the country, the deep France, where people are struggling.
They are.
And I think that divide is, if Macron gets re-elected, which I would bet he will, he's going to have that anger on the streets in the next 5 years.
And there'll be legislative elections to follow, whatever happens. I want to thank you, Vivian Walt. I want to thank as well Richard Verly, Elsa Vidal, and Gwendoline de Bono for being with us from Jerusalem. We want to thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.